Saturday, June 12, just after 2 a.m. A small New Jersey town rests under the weight of summer heat. Streetlights humming, houses lit with the glow of late conversations, and the steady rhythm of a community settling into the quiet hours. People laughed over card tables, glasses clinked, friends lingered just a little longer before parting ways. At 41 years old, Everton Thomas carried himself with a confidence that masked something far heavier beneath. He was a man already known to a few in the neighborhood. His presence, steady yet unsettling, often left those around him unsure where respect ended and unease began. But somewhere in that stretch of time, between the comfort of familiarity and the stillness of dawn, something vanished. A presence, a life, a man known to many simply stopped being where he was supposed to be. 2 days later, on June 14, an abandoned car appeared in nearby Pennsauken. The engine was cold, the seats empty, no driver in sight. Just silence, and questions. In towns like this, the assumption is always safety. Yet safety has a way of crumbling when the truth is hidden in plain view. But when one life suddenly goes silent, questions rise faster than answers. The kind that keeps families awake, pacing, waiting for a call that never comes. When someone you love disappears without a trace. How long before you begin to fear the unthinkable? Harold Miller Jr. was the kind of man you didn't just know you remembered. At 48, he was a fixture in Camden, New Jersey. Born and raised here, he walked the same streets his father had once known, built a modest but steady life, and carried with him a presence that seemed to soften even the hardest corners of the city. He wasn't famous, he wasn't wealthy, but in the ways that mattered, family, friendships, and belonging, Harold was rich. To his neighbors, he was more than a name. He was a familiar wave from across the street, the voice that greeted you at the corner store, the man who'd stop to ask about your mother or your kids, even when the day had already worn him thin. Life had not been easy. He was divorced, raising children he adored while navigating the challenges of being a single father. His job, long hours of labor, dependable but tiring, paid the bills, but what kept him going were the little joys. A Sunday meal with family. An afternoon walk down Ferry Avenue. And on Friday nights, a circle of friends, a deck of cards, and the sound of laughter that spilled late into the morning. It was his release, his way of keeping the rhythm of life steady, even when everything else tried to throw him off beat. Those card games were almost ritual. Everyone knew Harold would be there, grinning across the table, eyes narrowing when the stakes got high, and laughing, loud, unguarded when the game turned on him. He had a way of turning ordinary nights into memories, the kind of warmth that lingers long after the sound fades. To the people who sat across from him, Harold wasn't just a player, he was the pulse of the room. The one who made sure nobody left without feeling lighter than when they came in. Friday, June 11, 2021, began no differently. Camden's humid air clung to the skin, the kind of night when people gathered indoors, fans humming, cold drinks sweating on wooden tables. By evening, Harold had taken his usual spot in the living room of a friend's home, dominoes clicking against the board, cards passed hand to hand. Conversation flowed. The music in the background was faint, but the voices, his voice, rose above it, steady and familiar. He leaned back in his chair, laughed at an old joke retold for the 100th time, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it should be. As the night stretched into the early hours of Saturday, June 12, the gathering began to thin. People drifted out, hugging one another goodbye, promising to catch up the next week. Harold, still in good spirits, was one of the last to leave. Just after 2 a.m. He stepped out into the cool air, the streets quiet under the heavy glow of streetlights. The city that often crackled with noise seemed to pause. He pulled his jacket closer, keys jingling softly in his hand, and walked toward his car. For anyone watching, it was an ordinary moment. A man ending a night with friends, making his way home. But the weight of that moment grows heavier in hindsight. Because as far as anyone can say with certainty, it was the last time Harold Miller Jr. was seen alive. No alarms went off that night. No cries for help echoed across the block. Just a man, stepping into the quiet, carrying with him the simple expectation of tomorrow. That expectation, of course, never came. By the next morning, nothing seemed unusual. Harold wasn't the kind of man anyone expected to check in every hour. He valued his independence, and people respected that. But as Saturday rolled into Sunday, and then into Monday, his absence began to stretch. Calls went unanswered. Messages were read and forgotten. Doors he normally walked through stayed closed. To his family, worry crept in quietly at first, like a shadow at the edge of the day. But worry has a way of turning into panic when the silence lingers too long. In Camden, people had grown accustomed to hardship. This was a community that had seen jobs vanish, neighborhoods change, promises broken. Yet even here, where toughness was a requirement, Harold's absence hit differently. Friends stopped by his home. Family reached out to one another. Everyone kept asking the same question: where was Harold? By the time the police were notified, the circle of concern had already tightened, and whispers of fear were spreading. Because for Harold, disappearing without a word was unthinkable. And so the timeline began to take shape. June 12, just after 2 a.m., Harold was last seen walking away from the laughter of friends, stepping into the still night. Beyond that moment, the trail went cold. Each hour that passed without contact made the air heavier, every unanswered call a reminder that something was terribly wrong. The neighborhood that once seemed safe now carried a quiet unease, a sense that something had shifted, though no one could yet name it. What if this was the last night anyone saw you alive? Would anyone notice quickly enough? Would your absence ring loud in the lives you've touched, or would the silence take longer to break? For Harold Miller Jr., those questions weren't hypothetical. They became the very heartbeat of a search that began with simple concern and soon grew into something far more haunting. By the afternoon of Saturday, June 12, 2021, Harold's phone began to ring unanswered. At first, it didn't raise alarms. People miss calls. People get busy. Friends figured maybe he'd slept in late after a long night of cards, or maybe he was running errands in town. But as the hours dragged on, the silence only grew louder. His sister called once, then again, her voice filling his voicemail box with a mix of worry and irritation. His children reached out too, expecting the familiar warmth of their father's voice, only to be met with nothing but a cold recording. The people closest to Harold knew his habits, and vanishing without explanation was not one of them. By Sunday morning, the concern had shifted from mild to pressing. Harold's friends spoke among themselves, retracing the last night they had seen him. They recalled his laughter, the sound of him gathering his things before heading out into the night, and the way he left without any sign of trouble. To them, it didn't make sense. He never just vanished, one friend insisted. Even on his busiest weeks, Harold always made time to check in, to share a story, to let people know where he was. His absence was unnatural, like a missing piece in a puzzle that could no longer form its picture. Relatives gathered, calling hospitals, asking if Harold had been admitted under his name. They checked with neighbors, wondering if anyone had seen his car. A cousin drove by Harold's home, knocking on the door, hoping maybe he'd simply been inside all along. But the house was still, the windows closed, the driveway empty. The unease in Camden's close-knit circle began to spread. What started as worry now grew into fear, and in that fear, people began to ask a question they never thought they'd have to: where was Harold? The first step was to alert the authorities. Within 24 hours of Harold's last sighting, his family filed a missing persons report. On paper, it was simple: 48-year-old African-American male, last seen in the early hours of June 12 in Camden, New Jersey. On the streets, however, it was anything but simple. Families often expect a swift, forceful response when someone disappears, but investigators know the grim truth. Adults go missing every day, and not all of them are victims of crime. Some leave voluntarily. Some escape debts, jobs, or personal lives. And so, when Harold's name was added to the list of the missing, police approached with caution. To them, it was possible he had simply taken time for himself. To his family, that explanation felt impossible. That tension, the space between official procedure and desperate fear, would hang over the early hours of the case. Investigators asked routine questions. Did Harold have enemies? Did he struggle with his mental health? Was he facing financial pressure? Each question cut deeper into a family already on edge. His loved ones answered as best they could, no, no, no. Harold wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a man who walked away from his life. His responsibilities, his ties to his children, his deep roots in Camden, he was anchored. And anchors don't simply pull themselves loose in the night. As Monday turned into Tuesday, a new lead emerged, though it would bring more fear than relief. In nearby Pennsauken, a township just outside Camden, police found Harold's car. It was parked off the side of a quiet road, not hidden but not exactly placed where it would normally be left. At first glance, the vehicle looked intact, its body undamaged, windows unbroken. But it was the details inside that told a different story. The keys were missing, as though someone had carefully taken them away. The driver's seat had been shoved back further than Harold would have kept it, suggesting another person had been behind the wheel. Even the way the car sat, engine off, doors locked, abandoned, left investigators with an uneasy feeling. A man doesn't walk away from his car like that, not without reason. Detectives examined the scene closely. There was no shattered glass to suggest a break-in, no signs of a struggle around the vehicle, no trace of Harold himself. The car, once a symbol of routine and reliability, had become a ghostly placeholder. It sat waiting, holding questions no one could answer. For family and friends, the discovery only deepened their dread. Harold was nowhere to be found, yet here was his car, stripped of meaning, reduced to a silent witness no one could interrogate. At that moment, the reality began to sink in: this was not a simple disappearance. Harold had not chosen to leave. Something, or someone, had forced him into silence. In missing persons cases, investigators often say the first 48 hours are critical. In Harold's case, those hours had already passed, slipping away while people hoped he might still walk through the door. Now, the car was all they had, and it was far from enough. The car gave detectives one lead, but what they'd uncover next was far worse. Maple Avenue, Camden. A stretch of road that, to most, looked like any other in the city. Small homes sat shoulder to shoulder, paint peeling on some, flowers carefully tended on others. It was the kind of place where people kept their heads down, where families tried to carve out normal lives against the backdrop of a tough city. On this block stood the home of 41-year-old Everton Thomas. To the outside world, Everton was just another man making do, raising a family, keeping to himself. But what appeared ordinary would soon become the center of an investigation that stunned even seasoned detectives. Everton's reputation in Camden was complicated. Born and raised in the city, he grew up in the same neighborhoods that had shaped Harold. He was known as quiet, a man who didn't stir up trouble but also didn't earn much trust beyond his own circle. People recalled small hustles here and there, quick schemes to make a dollar, and brushes with the law that never escalated into anything lasting. He wasn't feared, and he wasn't admired, just a name people recognized. To most, Everton was a man trying to survive the grind, not someone capable of violence. Inside his home, Everton lived with his wife, Sherry, and their 22-year-old son, Deshaun. From the outside, the family looked stable enough. Sherry was seen tending to errands, Deshaun came and went with the rhythm of a young man trying to find his place in the world. Nothing about the household drew attention, and in neighborhoods like this, invisibility could be its own form of safety. Yet, behind those walls, something happened on the night of June 12 that would shatter every illusion of normalcy. The breakthrough came not from a confession, not from a neighbor's tip, but from a piece of technology that never looked away. Surveillance cameras, placed on nearby properties, had quietly captured the movements of that night. On the footage, Harold Miller Jr. can be seen walking up the steps to Everton's home just after 2 in the morning. He looked calm, unhurried, unaware that this would be the last door he ever entered. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. Minutes passed on the recording, still and uneventful. The kind of quiet that should have meant nothing at all. Then, almost imperceptibly, the silence broke. A faint crack, sharp, sudden cut through the stillness. The sound, later identified as the unmistakable pop of a gunshot, froze the timeline. On the footage, the house gave no clue, its walls concealing what had just taken place. But what the video did reveal was even more haunting: Harold never walked out again. Instead, the next movement belonged to Everton. The man of quiet reputation stepped into the camera's view, not carrying groceries, not leaving for work, but sliding into Harold's car. He started the engine, his face calm, his motions practiced. With no sign of panic, Everton drove the car away, heading toward Pennsauken, the same location where investigators would later find it abandoned. To detectives, the message was chilling. The car was not misplaced. It had been discarded. The footage left no room for comfort. There was Harold entering the home, and then, nothing. No return, no departure, no trace of life leaving those doors. The video didn't capture the act itself, but the sequence of events was enough to draw a horrifying conclusion. Something irreversible had taken place inside that house. For Harold's family, the knowledge was unbearable. For investigators, it was the moment when suspicion hardened into certainty. What began as a missing persons case was now something far darker. Surveillance cameras do not lie. They do not hesitate. They do not excuse. They capture what the human eye may miss, and in this case, they sealed a timeline that could not be undone. Investigators often say that evidence is like memory: it can fade, it can be clouded, but video does not forget. And here, it showed the story of a man who walked into a house and never came out. How do you hide a crime when the camera never blinks? Behind every crime, there are faces that live in the shadows. Some are victims, some are perpetrators, and some are pulled into the darkness by the very people they trust most. Inside the home on Maple Avenue, the story did not belong to Everton Thomas alone. It stretched to his wife, Sherry Parker, and their son, Deshaun. Together, they formed a family that, to the outside world, seemed ordinary, even unremarkable. But as investigators peeled back the layers, the ordinary became impossible to reconcile with what prosecutors alleged they chose to do. Sherry Parker was 41. She worked part-time jobs, often at local shops, sometimes cleaning houses to supplement the family's income. Neighbors described her as polite, quick to offer a smile, someone who asked about your children even if she was weighed down by her own troubles. That smile, though, masked a strain people sensed but couldn't define. Bills were often behind, the house carried the marks of neglect, and her life seemed tethered to a man whose schemes rarely led to stability. Still, she clung to her role as a mother and wife, projecting normalcy even as cracks widened beneath her feet. Then there was Deshaun, just 22, a young man caught between youth and adulthood. He was enrolled at a community college nearby, taking classes that he hoped would open doors to something better, anything that could lift him beyond the worn streets of Camden. Friends remembered him as quiet, impressionable, the kind of young man who followed rather than led. He spoke of ambitions but carried little certainty about how to reach them. To those who knew him, Deshaun was not hardened, not yet. He was still being shaped, still finding his place, still vulnerable to the pull of stronger wills around him. On paper, this was a family struggling but intact, trying to weather the difficulties of life in Camden. But prosecutors alleged that when the moment came, when Everton pulled a trigger and Harold Miller never walked out of that house, Sherry and Deshaun did not turn away. They did not call for help. They did not refuse to take part. Instead, investigators say, they made a choice that shattered every boundary of morality. They helped conceal the crime in the most grotesque way imaginable, by assisting in the dismemberment of Harold's body. To hear it laid out in court filings was almost unbearable. A woman who once carried the image of a caring mother. A son who once spoke of better days. Both accused of helping erase every trace of a man whose only crime was trusting the wrong friend. The very thought of it horrified the community. It was not only the killing itself that struck terror, but the betrayal woven into the aftermath. A family choosing silence and complicity over truth and justice. Neighbors who once waved to Sherry on the sidewalk struggled to understand. How could the woman who asked about their children's health be the same person accused of helping desecrate a human body? How could Deshaun, still so young, become a participant in something that would mark him forever? The questions ran deeper than the facts themselves. They touched on the fragility of trust, the way people wear masks that even the closest eyes fail to see. The betrayal did not rest in the act alone, it lived in the intimacy of the bond. Husband to wife. Parent to child. A family bound by love, but also, it seemed, bound by fear or loyalty, depending on how one chose to see it. Did Sherry act out of devotion to her husband, or was she trapped by the weight of his decisions? Did Deshaun obey because he was impressionable, or because he too had crossed a line he could not step back from? These were the questions investigators asked as they pieced together the chilling narrative inside that house. When blood ties become accomplices, what does that say about loyalty? Once Harold's car was discovered and surveillance footage was secured, the investigation shifted gears. Detectives no longer treated this as a case of a man who may have wandered off or chosen a fresh start. Instead, every second of recorded video, every still frame, became a piece of a puzzle that investigators were determined to solve. Analysts combed through the digital evidence with painstaking care, slowing the footage down frame by frame. They watched Harold enter Everton's house on Maple Avenue, saw the door close behind him, and marked the time. Just minutes later, the faint pop on the audio track sealed the suspicion that something irreversible had occurred inside those walls. The digital trail did not stop there. Investigators pulled metadata from surrounding cameras, searching for patterns of movement on the block that night. They tracked the glow of headlights, the flicker of shadows, and matched the timeline against Everton's claim that Harold had left on his own. The data told a different story. Harold had never been seen leaving. What's more, Everton himself was clearly caught driving Harold's car away, an act he could not explain away with half-truths. The more the footage was examined, the clearer the deception became, and with it came a question investigators could not yet answer: where was Harold's body? Forensic teams began searching Everton's home. They moved carefully, collecting samples from floors, walls, and furniture. It was not what they saw at first glance, but what they smelled and sensed that unsettled them. A sharp trace of bleach clung to the air, cutting through the usual scent of a lived-in house. Bleach is a cleaner, but in investigations like these, it is also a flag. It is the scent of erasure, a sign that someone is trying to scrub away what should not be erased. Swabs and tests revealed patches where bleach had been heavily applied, raising suspicions that blood had once been there. The absence of visible evidence was, in itself, a kind of evidence. It spoke of a deliberate attempt to cover tracks. When Everton was confronted with these findings, his story began to unravel. He told detectives Harold had left after a brief visit. He insisted he had no knowledge of where Harold went. Yet his words collided with the cold, objective record of the cameras and the chemical traces in his home. His tone remained calm, but the inconsistencies piled up, and with each contradiction, detective suspicions grew heavier. To the investigators, the lies were not only frustrating, they were cruel. Every false answer pushed Harold's family further from the closure they desperately needed. For detectives, the most agonizing part of the investigation was not confirming what happened inside the house. The video and forensic evidence already pointed toward violence. The agony lay in what they could not find: Harold himself. Without a body, the case was harder to close, the charges more complex, and the grief of the family nearly unbearable. Investigators scoured nearby woods, dumpsters, and waterways, searching for even the smallest trace. They followed tips that led nowhere, dug through refuse with gloves and rakes, praying for a clue. Day after day, they came up empty. For men and women trained to bring answers, the silence was suffocating. One investigator, speaking later, described the frustration as a kind of personal wound. He said, "You want to give the families something to hold on to, something to bury, some way to say goodbye. But without remains, you can't give them that. All you can give them is the truth of what you believe happened. And sometimes, that isn't enough." His words cut to the heart of the case. This wasn't only about evidence and charges, it was about dignity, about the human need to lay a loved one to rest. That need remained unanswered, leaving a hole not just in the family but in the entire community. Camden felt the weight of Harold's disappearance in ways both public and private. Neighbors who once nodded to Everton across the street now closed their blinds. Families began locking their doors earlier, questioning how well they really knew the people living around them. In churches, prayers were lifted not just for Harold's return, but for the strength of his family as they faced the unknown. Vigils were held, candles flickering against the summer night, each flame representing both hope and grief. The city, already hardened by years of hardship, found itself shaken by the horror of what had unfolded in one of its homes. Fear spread quietly. If something like this could happen to Harold, an ordinary man, a father, a friend, then who was truly safe? The randomness of it was what unsettled people most. This was not a gang conflict or a public crime. This was a private betrayal, hidden within the walls of a family home. It blurred the lines of safety, making people question not just the strangers on the street, but the neighbors they had known for years. In that fear lived a painful realization: sometimes, danger is not a shadow outside your door. Sometimes, it is inside someone else's, waiting. If this could happen in a family home, could it happen in yours? By the time prosecutors began to piece together what had happened after Harold Miller walked into the home on Maple Avenue, the story took on a shape so disturbing it was difficult to put into words. They believed the violence did not end with a single gunshot. What followed was an attempt not just to take Harold's life, but to erase every trace that he had ever been there. It was an effort that investigators described as deliberate, meticulous, and cruel. This was not an accident that spiraled out of control. It was a choice, a series of decisions made inside that house, decisions that would turn the investigation from tragedy to horror. According to prosecutors, Harold's body was concealed in the most grotesque way imaginable. The allegations painted a picture of dismemberment, of a man reduced from the fullness of life to fragments, handled not with dignity but with the intent of erasure. Investigators said bleach was used heavily, tools taken from the home repurposed for a task too grim to fathom. They described floors scrubbed until the wood itself seemed worn, drains flushed with chemical burn, and garbage bags filled with pieces of evidence that were never meant to be found. Though his remains were never recovered, the traces left behind spoke loudly, revealing not just the violence of the act but the determination to hide it. Sherry Parker, the wife who neighbors once saw as friendly and devoted, was drawn into this unthinkable sequence. Prosecutors allege she helped clean, that her hands carried out acts she once reserved for her children and her home, now turned toward concealing a crime. Some believe she did it out of loyalty, standing by her husband no matter the cost. Others think fear may have played a role, that the weight of Everton's actions left her believing there was no way back, no way to undo what had been done. But in either version, the truth remains: she crossed a line, trading silence for complicity. Deshaun Thomas, only 22, stood at a crossroads that night, and the path he took may have marked his life forever. Friends remembered him as impressionable, a young man who followed rather than led. Prosecutors said his youth did not spare him. Instead, he became another set of hands in the concealment, assisting in the disposal, moving objects, scrubbing surfaces, erasing traces of a man who had been alive only hours before. For investigators, this was not just about evidence. It was about the betrayal of innocence. A son, barely grown, entangled in an act that no young man should ever face, much less carry out. To describe the family's role is to confront an impossible question: how does love twist into such destruction? A wife who should have been a voice of conscience, a son who should have chosen escape, both now stood accused of being protectors, not of life, but of death. It is this betrayal that left the deepest wound in the community. For Harold's family, it was unbearable to think that three people, bound by blood, could work together not to save him but to erase him. For investigators, it was proof that evil does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes, it is carried out within the walls of a home, where loyalty becomes a weapon. In court documents, prosecutors avoided sensationalism, but the facts spoke loudly enough. They described rooms scrubbed too clean, corners of the house stripped bare, and neighbors who recalled unusual activity late into the night. Bags were seen carried out, a car moving at odd hours. The house, once unnoticed, now seemed filled with ghosts. The alleged disposal of Harold's body may never be fully known, because without remains, there is no complete answer. But what was left behind was enough to chill even the most hardened investigators. It was not only about what was done, but about who chose to do it. The emotional conflict was as undeniable as the crime itself. Sherry was a mother, torn between the man she had married and the son she had raised. Her choice to protect one seemed to ensnare the other. Deshawn, at an age when he should have been stepping into independence, was instead dragged into the darkness of his father's actions. For a family that once appeared ordinary, every bond now carried the weight of betrayal. What should have been their strength became their destruction. When the truth is too horrific to accept, families often choose silence over justice. By the time the case reached court, the community was bracing itself for the painful details to be spoken aloud. The mystery that had started with a missing man now carried the full weight of a criminal trial. Prosecutors announced the charges with clarity and precision. Against Everton Thomas, the accusations were severe: first-degree murder, desecration of human remains, and tampering with evidence. Against his wife, Sherry Parker, and their son, Deshawn Thomas, the charges reflected their alleged part in the concealment, desecration of human remains and tampering with evidence. In that courtroom, the faces that once blended into a neighborhood now stood as symbols of betrayal, their names etched into a story no one could have imagined. The prosecution opened its case with the timeline. They laid out every detail, step by step, connecting each piece of evidence until the story became impossible to ignore. They showed the surveillance footage, Harold Miller entering the house on Maple Avenue in the early hours of June 12. They replayed the faint crack of a gunshot captured on the recording. Then they revealed the footage of Everton sliding behind the wheel of Harold's car, driving it to Pennsauken where it was later abandoned. Piece by piece, they drew the jury's attention to the quiet but undeniable truth: Harold never walked out of that house alive. Prosecutors did not stop with the footage. They spoke of bleach-soaked floors and drains that tested positive for cleaning agents, of rooms scrubbed too clean in a house that had once been cluttered and lived in. They pointed to inconsistencies in Everton's statements, contradictions that revealed themselves under questioning. They described a man whose calm demeanor hid a deliberate act of erasure, a man who not only pulled a trigger but enlisted his own family in covering the evidence. To the prosecution, this was not just murder, it was calculated, cold, and compounded by the cruelty of concealment. But in every courtroom, there are two sides, and the defense was prepared to counter. Everton's attorneys argued that the evidence, while disturbing, was not definitive. They pressed on the fact that Harold's remains had never been recovered, suggesting that without a body, no one could know with absolute certainty what had happened. They questioned whether the sound on the video could be conclusively proven as a gunshot. They raised doubts about the reliability of chemical tests, hinting that bleach in a home might not always signal a crime. And then, they turned the spotlight to Sherry and Deshawn, painting them not as co-conspirators but as victims of coercion. The defense suggested that Sherry acted out of fear, trapped in a marriage with a man who demanded loyalty no matter the cost. They argued that Deshawn was manipulated by his father, too young and impressionable to resist. In their telling, Everton was not only the central figure in the crime but also the force that pulled his family into it, using the bonds of trust to control them. This framing did not absolve Everton, but it cast shadows of doubt over Sherry and Deshawn's true level of involvement. Were they criminals, or were they hostages to a man's violence? As the legal arguments unfolded, the heart of the trial belonged not to the lawyers but to the voices of Harold's family. One by one, his relatives stood before the court, their words cutting through the layers of evidence and strategy. His sister spoke of unanswered calls, of the helplessness she felt as days turned into weeks without news. His children, their voices trembling, described the emptiness left in their lives. They talked about birthdays missed, advice never given, and the unbearable thought of not knowing where their father's body lay. Every word reminded the jury that this was not just a case, it was a wound that would never heal. The absence of Harold's remains deepened the pain in ways the courtroom could scarcely capture. Without a body, there was no burial, no grave to visit, no final act of closure. His family's grief was suspended in midair, unresolved and unending. For them, the trial was not just about justice, it was about recognition of their loss, about forcing the world to see Harold not as a file number or a headline but as a man whose life mattered. Their tears filled the room, a stark contrast to the cold arguments exchanged between lawyers. For the jury, the trial became more than a weighing of evidence. It became a confrontation with the human cost of violence. They saw the footage, yes, and heard the arguments. But they also felt the silence left behind in Harold's absence, the way it reached beyond one family to touch an entire community. Neighbors testified too, describing how the case had shaken their sense of safety, how they struggled to explain to their children that someone could disappear and never return. The courtroom was no longer just a chamber of law, it was a mirror of a neighborhood broken by betrayal. Each day of the proceedings carried its own tension. Some days the prosecution's evidence seemed overwhelming, painting a picture too clear to ignore. Other days the defense's questions stirred uncertainty, raising the possibility that Sherry and Deshawn's roles were more complicated than prosecutors claimed. The jury sat between these competing stories, tasked with finding clarity in a case defined by absence. And all the while, Harold's family watched, waiting not just for a verdict but for acknowledgement that what they lost could never be replaced. In the end, the trial was not only about who pulled the trigger or who scrubbed the floors. It was about how a community confronts betrayal, how a family absorbs grief without closure, and how justice is sought in the shadow of silence. It was about the fragile line between fear and loyalty, about choices made in the dead of night that ripple outward into the lives of countless others. For the jury, for the family, for the community, this was a story that left no one untouched. Years have passed since the night of June 12, 2021. The evidence has been weighed, the charges announced, the courtroom arguments made. Yet one fact remains untouched, immovable, and devastating: Harold Miller Jr. has never been found. No grave carries his name. No headstone marks the place where his children can kneel and whisper goodbyes. His family still waits for the chance to bury their loved one, to place flowers on sacred ground, to give their grief the closure that only a body can bring. Instead, they carry a silence that no verdict can erase. The unanswered question echoes beyond the courtroom. Where is Harold? The surveillance tapes told a story of entry with no return. The forensics pointed to violence and concealment. The testimonies confirmed the void left in his family's life. Yet the physical truth, the remains of a man whose presence once filled rooms with laughter, has never been recovered. For investigators, that absence is a mark of unfinished work. For the family, it is a wound that will not close. And for the community, it is a reminder that some questions outlive every attempt to answer them. In Camden, the ripple effects of Harold's disappearance and death changed the way people looked at one another. A community built on resilience was shaken by the realization that betrayal can grow inside the walls of an ordinary home. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings with Sherry now carry memories they cannot reconcile. Friends who once shared tables with Harold now carry chairs that sit empty. And children in the neighborhood learn too soon that safety is not always guaranteed, even in the places we trust most. This case was not only about violence, it was about the fragility of trust itself. Trust is the foundation of every home, every friendship, every bond we build. It allows us to close our eyes at night and believe we will wake to another day unchanged. But when trust is broken, when it is not strangers but loved ones who protect cruelty, the rupture is deep, and it spreads far beyond the immediate loss. Harold's story reminds us of that fragility, of how quickly the familiar can turn to fear. It is a lesson carried not only by his family, but by every person who followed this case, by every neighbor who locked their door a little earlier, by every parent who looked at their child with new questions. There is also the horror of betrayal inside homes. What should be sanctuaries of care and comfort can, in rare and tragic moments, become spaces of silence and complicity. In the case of Everton, Sherry, and Deshawn, the home was not a place of refuge, it became a prison of loyalty and fear, a place where the bonds of family did not protect life but helped conceal death. For many who watched the trial unfold, this was the hardest truth to accept. Because if betrayal can grow in a family, if complicity can cross generations, then where does safety begin? And where does it end? Through all of this, Harold himself must never be lost in the telling. He was not just a name in a file or a subject in a courtroom. He was a man who worked hard, who raised children, who gave his friends laughter and his family love. The crime erased his presence, but it cannot erase his memory. His story is carried forward not only by the tragedy of what was done to him but by the resilience of those who refused to let his life be defined only by its end. If justice can punish the guilty but never return the missing, what does justice truly mean? In Camden, the candles still burn. In Harold's family, the questions still remain. And for all of us, the story of Harold Miller Jr. is more than a case, it is a reminder of life's fragility, of the weight of trust, and of the shadows that can sometimes grow where we least expect them. It is a story unfinished, a wound unhealed, and a memory that demands we never look away.